Hi, I'm Rob Cosman. Welcome to my shop. We're going to talk about dado joints. Some people call it a housing or a trench joint. Either way, it's extremely common in furniture and cabinets. I'm going to show you the 3 ways that I do it. Stay with us. I'm Rob Cosman and welcome to my shop. We make it our job to help take your woodworking to the next level. If you're new and you haven't subscribed, please do so. Hit the notification bell so you'll receive alerts when we release a new video. And anytime we use a special tool, we'll always leave a description down below. All right, let's get to work. Extremely common joint. Nothing more than a groove cut across the grain, and the matching piece fits in there. Should be nice and snug. And if you want to learn more about the dado joint and its applications, I recently did a video on it. We'll leave a link below. What I want to talk about today and show you are the 3 different ways that I cut the dado joint. Now, the most common is on table saw with something called a dado blade. We'll go through the entire process. This one actually is done in a piece of plywood. I'm going to use a piece of torrefied maple, but essentially the same application. The second joint I'm going to do is using a dado. Is using a router, which is not my favorite. I find that you just don't have the same amount of control, but for some folks who don't have a table saw, it's an option. And the third one we're going to save, which is the most interesting, and that's where we cut it entirely by hand. And if you're into hand tools, you're really going to love this. So this is called a stacked dado set. And when you buy it, this is an 8-inch diameter. This is the most common size, designed to fit on a 10-inch blade, or 10-inch table saw. So this is your outside cutter, and this is your other outside cutter. And if you look down the tooth line, what you'll notice is that almost all the teeth are sloped towards one side. And this side that they're high on, that's going to be the outside of that particular, that's going to be the outside cutter. You'll see there's a wide space right here. I'll tell you what that's about in a minute. And then there's a couple of teeth that are full width, a rip tooth, and that's to help clean up what these leave behind, because you can imagine that these are going to leave somewhat of a V groove because of that shape. Well, that comes along and cleans up some of that material. So that's your, in the case of how it would sit in here, for me, this is going to be the right side, and this one is going to be the left side. You got to make sure you get those right. These are carbide. You can get them high-speed steel, but I prefer the carbide. They last a lot longer between sharpenings. So in addition to your 2 outside blades, you also get what are called chippers. And these are typically 1/8 of an inch. In this case, you get 4 that are 1/8 of an inch and 1 that's a 1/16 of an inch. And just a flat piece of steel with a carbide tooth on either side. The carbide sticks out beyond the body of the chipper itself. So when you put these in, you have to make sure that A, the cutting face is heading in the same direction. And this wide space that you see between these 2 teeth and these 2 teeth are where you're going to set that one down. If you set it anywhere else, it's probably going to get, the carbide is going to be sitting up high and it's not going to lock together nice and tight. That's not the way you want to use it. So you put that in that position so that the 2 bodies, the body of the blade and the body of the chipper, will sit nice and tight together. You don't have to if you don't want to, but you can stagger these or you can put them together. It doesn't matter, just as long as the carbide does not sit high on the body of the opposite chipper. So you would simply add up the number that you need. If you're going for 3/4, which is what we're going to do, I'm going to use all of the large size or the 1/8 inch chippers. Put that on backwards. Try to follow my own instructions. And then the last one is going to go on there. And again, you're going to line up that tooth with that wide spot in between these 2 teeth. And you'd put that, clamp that in place, and you would produce a 3/4 inch dado. Now, if you need it to be a little bit bigger, or if you've got to customize it, and that's where you can use your 1/16 inch. And you can also buy shims. I don't have my complete set. I've lost some of them over the years, but you can actually make them up with, I've often made them out of cardstock, but these are just brass shims, and you put them in between the chippers so that you can space it out just a little bit more if you need to. That's a 20 thou. That's a 16 thou, that's 31 thou. I had 2 or 3 others, so you can pretty much make any combination you need. It allows you to make that dado exactly the width of the piece that's going to fit into it. Now, if you have a normal table saw, it's just a matter of switching out your throat plate. So that one is designed for a single blade. This one is actually customize it depending on how wide you want. It's nice, and one of the real secrets to using a dado and getting good results is to have a zero clearance throat plate. What that means is that when you bring the blade up through the throat plate for the first time, this edge and this edge are going to be right against the outside cutting surfaces on that dado blade. And what that means is when the chipper, the cutter is coming down through the wood, this supports the wood fiber right where it's being cut, hence zero clearance. And that, in addition to a sharp blade, is your best bet for getting a splinter-free cut. And that's a big deal because if you're using plywood, the last thing you want is to have that plywood, thin ply veneer on the outside all splintered. Now, what I've got to do, I've got a saw stop, so I have to replace the cartridge. And just in case you've never seen one, so this has a cartridge that will stop the blade in the event that it touches something that conducts electricity, whether it be skin or metal or wet wood. But you have to replace and put in this one, which is much wider and also compensates for the difference between a 10-inch blade and an 8-inch blade. I'll go ahead and change that out, and then I'll show you the setup once it's done. And when you're dealing with carbide blades, you want to be careful. You don't want to bang those fragile pieces of carbide against a piece of steel, as even though they stay sharp a very long time, they're very brittle and they'll break when they're hit against something hard. Now, if you look down at this and you see that the shaft on the table saw typically is not very long, mostly designed for using a 1/8-inch thick blade. You put a dado on there, you don't have a whole lot of thread left on the outside, but I'll show you how I do it. Now I need my, remember you want obviously the teeth cutting in this rotation, and you want the teeth that are shaped pointed off to my left to be on the left side. So set that in there. Now know where your wide spot is. So again, I've got the chipper face with the tooth facing the same direction. Make sure it sits in there, and you know it's in the right place when it lays nice and flat against the inside of the blade. And then, as I said, you don't have to stagger these. They're balanced anyway. And when we put this last one on, just know where the wide spot is. Line it up. And you can tell if it's sitting properly because everything is tight. Now, I've got about 5/8 of an inch. Well, that's enough to put I like to use this large diameter stabilizing washer. And I still have about 1/4 of an inch of threads, and that's enough. If you're worried about that, you could take the stabilizing washer off and just use the nut. I don't think it's going to be a problem as thick as these blades are and that small diameter being 8-inch versus 10, that you don't really need that stabilizer. I just like to have it on there anyway. Make sure that gets nice and snug. Now, if you're using your throat plate for the first time, then you're going to want to make sure that your blade is sitting down below the surface. I've already used mine, so I don't have to worry about this, but if I was doing this for the first time, what I would do is bring my fence over and have it sit somewhere like that, so it's going to hold that in place. Turn your saw on and then slowly wind it up through, and it'll come up, and there you've got your zero clearance. I don't have a zero clearance here. It's close, but it's not going to be right on, but I think it should still do a good job because those blades are nice and sharp. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is we want to get our height set. So this is where you're going to want a piece of scrap. And some of the most common injuries on table saws are when folks use too small a piece of scrap and there's just no mass to it, and they do something to check a dimension, and the next thing you know, it kicks out of their hand and they get hurt. So make sure you're using something that's got enough mass to it that you can safely keep your hands away from the blade. All right, now I want this to be 1/4 of an inch deep. If I'm using 3/4 inch material, I'm typically going to have my dado just 1/4 of an inch. So I'll take a guess at this first. It's not quite 3/16. I'd rather make small adjustments and have to do it 3 or 4 times than to go too much and then have to start over. That should be it. Okay, that's right on 1/4. Now, you can't really pay attention to your guide down here because when you put a dado on there, you're adding blades to the right, and that means it's going to throw this off. So, best to just shut it down. Measure from this tooth, or the outside of that tooth. I want to put 3 on here, so I'm going to make this one 2 inch. Okay. Now, one of the safety things that you have to be aware of, you're used to fighting the resistance of just one blade. Well, I essentially have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. How many have I got on there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 blades. So now you've got a whole lot more resistance. That's like pushing a piece of wood through 6 table saw blades at the same time. So you have to be aware of that. I'm going to keep my hands plenty far away. I've got lots of surface area there. If you're not comfortable with that, this is where you'd want to use a miter gauge. I want to keep pressure across the entire width. It's always nice to work with flat stock and pass it all the way through. Okay, now this is torrefied maple, which fractures easily, but I still got a pretty clean cut. I haven't finished this. You can see the mill marks, so when I go in and plane, I'll get rid of that, but that's pretty close. If you want, you can sometimes put a piece of masking tape over there and cut through the masking tape, and that will help prevent some of that. But your best bet, of course, is at 0 clearance, and if you're, like I said, if you're working plywood, it's worth the investment in another throat plate that you specifically set for that thickness of dado. So that's as simple as it gets. If my depth wasn't perfect all the way through, I can go in and use a router plane to clean that up. But a table saw with a dado stack is undoubtedly the fastest and I think probably the most accurate way to cut dados. All right, so this is the second way of cutting it with a router. It's my least favorite, absolute last option. However, if you don't have a table saw and you don't think you have the skill to do it by hand, I guess this is what you would have to do. And I'll give you a few ideas that'll make it a little bit easier. So the first thing, we need a good fence. I drew a mark on there where I'm going to cut the dado. I do the mark and I put an X. So the X is the side that we're going to actually cut on. Now, you can use a router just as it comes. The problem is that I find that if you have to work up against a fence, and rarely do these are the sides of the base plate nice and flat. So I added a base to mine. Wasn't hard. Use a piece of 1 inch MDF. Now you'd want thinner if you've got small bits that aren't very long, but this one has all the capacity I need. So I've got a much longer, in fact that works out to being 12 1/4 inches long. It's nice and straight, and it'll run against there. You want to make sure that your fence is longer than the board because you want to have support before the bit engages and you want to have support after the bit disengages so that you're not slipping around to one side or the other. So what I'm going to do first is measure the distance from the outside. I'm using a 3/4 bit. Actually, it cuts a little bit less than that. Measuring the outside of the bit, outside of the cutting radius, to the outside edge. And if I look at that, I'm 3 3/16. So we'll come in here and we'll use that, set that at 3 1/16. Now I'm going to use, I've got a clamp on there just to keep that board somewhat still. I'll use my square. You want to make sure that your fence, the two edges are parallel. Okay. When you see what you have to do to get this prepared, you certainly appreciate a table saw with a good fence. Just come in and check that again. Okay. Now, this bit's actually undersized for 3/4. So what I'm going to do is come in and put a couple layers. This is painter's tape. And if I measure it with a micrometer, it's 5/1000 of an inch. So it's a little thicker than a sheet of paper. I'm going to put 2 layers in here. Okay, now there's a fair bit of force involved. I need to set this for, depending on the wood that you're cutting through, you may want to do it in a couple of passes. I think I can go through this one in one pass. So I'm going to set this depth for 1/4 of an inch. That's not my... Okay. Make sure that's locked. Now, when you run a bit through there, it's cutting all the way around, so you really need to be in command. So I'm going to push hard against the fence and relatively slow, although you don't want to be too slow or you're going to burn. Make sure nothing's in my way. Now, one of the things I don't like about that is the fact that you're trying to cut a full width. If you try to cut this a 3/4 with a 3/4 bit, I just find that it doesn't always give you exactly what you want. So it's nice to go in and hog it all out and then come back and do a much finer cut. I'm going to remove those 2 pieces of tape, and I want to be cutting. I want to be cutting against rotation, so the bit is rotating this way. So because I took the tape off, this is going to move farther over, which means I'm going to cut this side, and I'm cutting against rotation. You don't want to do a climb cut. Climb cut would be if I was cutting the other way and moving it in this direction. The cutter's running this way, and it's going to want to pull your router along. Not good. Yeah, I know. Now, you almost always have a tendency to get a little bit of tear out there. I could have put another piece of wood in, or just make your board a little bit longer so you can go ahead and trim that off. But now I've got a nice clean cut on there. That final pass was just 0.010 of an inch. And you could do the same thing by adding some tape on it in order to come this way just a little bit without having to move your fence. Once the fence is in place, I like to just leave it there. Now, it's not terrible, but it certainly is not my favorite way of doing it. Of course, one advantage you have is that it gives you a square bottom. You don't have the little rabbit ears that are produced on the Dado blade. They always cut down a little bit deeper on the two outside edges, whereas this one is giving you a nice flat square bottom. You have to take care to not tear out the ends. Where we started back here, it hauled out a chip, and the same thing occurred over here. So as I mentioned, you can either put a couple of blocks on either side, or you can simply start with the board a little bit wider than you need and just rip that little bit off, and it'll leave you nice clean. You can also do a stop dado. We didn't mention this on the table saw, but a lot of times when you're building a cabinet, you don't want to see this out front. So you're going to stop your dado somewhere back here. You can do it quite easily with the router by simply putting a stop, either a mark on your fence or actually clamping a block on so you'll actually stop before you exit, and then you can go in with a chisel and just square the corners if need be. On the table saw, same thing. Put a stop block on your fence so that you stop before you come all the way out. The problem there is you're going to have the radius of the dado head, which means you're not going to have full depth. That is a little bit of work. You come in with a chisel along the end, and then go in and clean that out. Not a big deal. Okay, this third method, done by hand, is going to take a little bit longer, but you can leave the radio on. You don't have to worry about a dust mask, ear protection. Lots of advantages. I'm going to go ahead and put a red mark on there. Put an X on the side where we're going to cut it. Now, I'm going to make that 1/4 inch deep. So I'll set my marking gauge at 1/4. And then we'll just leave a mark down here so we know. The same on this side. Now this might be a little bit unorthodox, but I found it works extremely well and very accurate. So I've got a couple pieces of plywood that have square edges and sides that are parallel. So I'm going to put this on the mark, put that piece in place. I'm going to clamp that in. Check it before we go any further. Okay, that's good. Now, I'm going to use a crosscut saw, and I want to mark. I need a Sharpie. So I'm going to take my Sharpie. I'm going to put this on here, and I'm going to set it 1/4 inch up from the bottom of the points of the teeth. This is just an approximate. I'll put a mark on here that'll easily come off with a little bit of lacquer thinner. Now I'm going to cut one side of my dado, and I'm going to hold this other piece against the saw to keep this standing plumb. And I'll just simply saw down until we reach that line. Now, if you wanted to, you could put a little bit of wax on there, and that'll just help that slide a little easier. Okay, so we're down to our line. Now, we're going to put this piece, which is the part that we're going to set into the dado. What we're going to do next is put this in place. And if there was any cup in this board, then what I would do is I'd go in with another clamp, 2 clamps, and I would squeeze this. I would squeeze this on both sides to pull this flat. And then under the pressure of the clamp, I would come in and put this clamp on this piece. Then I'll remove this one. Take this off. Now I take that piece of tape and put it in here. Actually, the sticky's gone on that, so I'm going to use a new one. Now, take my saw, same line, squeeze that against. Okay, now there's a couple ways that we can remove that material. We could come in with a shoulder plane, a little less than 3/4, and plane that out. But I'm going to do it with a chisel, and I'll finish it with a router plane. Now I'm going to use a narrow chisel just so I can stay away from those outside edges. I don't want to ruin that. I'm going to use the chisel with the bevel down. That allows me to control the depth and prevent that from digging down too deep. Now, I don't want to come off, I don't want to plow out that way. I want to come in from this end. We're a little shallow here. Okay, now this is a Lee Nielsen router plane. I've just mounted it to a piece of maple just to give me a little more reference, but I don't want to try to take 1/4 inch depth at once. So what I'm going to do is do that in 3 or 4 passes. Pull that up. I find it easier to take several small passes than to try to hog it out with one heavy one. Again, when you come to the end, you're better off to come in . Okay, now we can drop that down a little farther. Just keeping an eye on that mark. Make sure we don't go down too low. This should be our last one. You want to get right into those corners. At the same time, you need to protect these walls. Okay. Check a square, have a square and check that. That's good. Nice snug fit. Bottomed out. Now, how would you cut a stop dado? Well, the easiest way to do it would be to, before you start, rip a narrow piece off, maybe 1/4 of an inch off of this edge. Go ahead and cut your dado like we just did. Then glue that piece back on. The grain lines will line right up. Flush it up. You'd never know it came off. That is probably my favorite way of cutting a dado, just because it's so quiet. You actually get to touch the wood. There you go. There's 3 of them. If you enjoy my method of work and like my style of teaching, click on any one of these videos to help take your woodworking to the next level. Now, I've always said, better tools make the job so much easier. If you click on the icon with the plane and the chisel, it'll take you to our website, introduce you to all of our tools that we actually manufacture right here, as well as our workshops, both in person and online. Good luck.